they believe that you're one of the main roadblocks on getting those goals accomplished. How do you respond to that?
I'm not a roadblock at all.
Senator Joe Manchin does not believe he's a roadblock when it comes to passing Joe Biden's policy proposals, including the $2.25 trillion infrastructure bill. The only problem is he is a giant obstacle. In fact, he's currently working with Republicans in order to defeat certain components of the proposal. And of course, unsurprisingly, the components that we're talking about here are the very components that are most popular in the infrastructure bill. Now, the biggest issue that Republicans have, clearly, and some corporate Democrats, is the potential of increasing the corporate tax rate. There are other issues involved as well, and I want to share those issues with you. So Senate Republicans have proposed a ridiculous counter proposal, $568 billion infrastructure counteroffer last week. Now bipartisan talks on a compromise proposal between $600 billion and $1 trillion are just getting started. Now let me remind you all, I've already stated it, but I'll state it again. Biden has proposed a $2.25 trillion infrastructure bill. And right now, the bipartisan negotiations are somewhere in the ballpark of $600 billion and $1 trillion. Now, Democrats, according to The Hill, are nervous. They're nervous about Manchin's opposition to Biden's proposal to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, saying a 25% rate is more reasonable. He met last week with Senator Lindsey Graham to explore ways to fund a compromise infrastructure package without relying heavily on tax increases. Now remember, the corporate tax rate prior to Trump taking office and passing his tax cuts for the rich was 35%. Trump lowered it to 21%, and Biden wasn't even proposing to increase it back to 35%. He decided, maybe I'll go halfway to 28%, maybe that's enough. And you have corporate Democrats and of course the GOP saying, no, we can't even have that. Let's start talking about maybe 25%, maybe. And of course you have Manchin going along with this nonsense. Now, Woz, before I get to all of the other ways in which Senator Joe Manchin wants to essentially strip this bill down, I wanted to get your thoughts on the tax component of it.
You know, it's interesting when Manchin talks about sort of this bipartisan dreck, right? And the first thing he wants to attack as far as compromise and leave on the cutting room floor is all the stuff that would affect normal everyday citizens as far as home health aides, et cetera, et cetera. Everyday citizens, we gotta sacrifice you. But corporations, we can't tax them at 28%, even though it was previously at 35 and the world somehow did not burn. And my problem with the dog and pony show that he always does before these things come up to a vote, at least, Anna, when we were kids, you know, our parents would come up with different tricks during Christmas time or the Tooth Fairy to try to lie to us and, you know, trick us into thinking these things are real. Manchin doesn't even bother with his fairy tale of how magical bipartisanship is. He just comes out and says, it's great. He doesn't come out and say, hey man, when we did the crime bill, it was bipartisan and everybody loved it. When we did Iraq, it was great, it was bipartisan, everybody loved it. The Patriot Act, it was awesome, it was bipartisan. He doesn't even give us examples of bipartisanship working. He just lies and says that it's just great in and of itself. That's what kills me about Joe Manchin, is that he doesn't even try to lie to us anymore.
Well, one other thing to keep in mind about Joe Manchin as we talk about other details related to this story is that he really led the charge when it came to caving to the demands of the GOP in regard to Biden's coronavirus relief package. His whole thing was, you know, we gotta work in a bipartisan way. We have to. I mean, we don't want to be extreme. We want unity. And so he led the charge in essentially decreasing the amount of money Americans would get in the unemployment benefits. Originally, the proposal was $400 per week. He got it down to $300 per week, something that Republicans wanted. And there were other things stripped away, including, by the way, means testing when it came to the direct relief checks to Americans. And so he put in all that work. He caved to all these GOP lawmakers. And what did he get in return? How many GOP lawmakers in the Senate voted in favor of Biden's coronavirus relief package? I can't remember. Woz, do you remember how many GOP members voted in favor of it?
None.
Zero. So Joe Manchin failed. Okay, so I don't want to hear anything about the need for bipartisanship from a man who hasn't even been able to carry it out after handing all of his bananas over to the GOP. Now, Manchin is also talking about conventional infrastructure and how Biden needs to kind of take out some of the other stuff that, maybe constituents are too dumb to understand. And if you don't believe me in regard to his language, let's watch the video.
There seems to be a bit of a disconnect on how to define infrastructure here. President Biden has broader ambitions. He, for example, has a plan inside his big proposal that includes $400 billion for in-home care for elderly Americans and those with disabilities, also billions more for childcare facilities. Do you support that?
Well, here's the thing. All the things that he has stated that's needed is needed. I do think they should be separated because when you start putting so much into one bill, which we call an omnibus bill, makes it very, very difficult for the public to understand.
It makes it very difficult, Woz, for the public to understand. You see, the American people are just too stupid to understand that, hey, if people have to stay home and take care of elderly family members or children, they're not gonna want that group together with an infrastructure bill. I mean, they're gonna be against it if you include it in an infrastructure bill. They're not gonna, it's gonna be too confusing for them. I mean, how insulting is that language? And by the way, they're not too stupid to understand it. The vast majority of Americans favor the infrastructure bill as it is proposed right now. I'll give you those numbers in a second, but Woz, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, it's just, the logic that nobody could understand how Granny might need a home health aide so that everybody can go to work and, you don't have to actually come out of pocket for it because those bills can get very expensive. I think Americans would understand why the government should handle that. Also, I love the idea because Manchin came out and he said, well, the reason why we got to do this bipartisan stuff because we got to sell this idea to all Americans. We got to work with Republicans to sell this to the American public. Sir, excuse me. The 2.2 trillion is already got overwhelming American support. It's already been sold, brother. You're the one that needs to do the selling, which is why he's out here shucking and jiving on behalf of corporations. And more importantly, Anna, man, what kind of politics do we have that Joe Manchin feels completely fine putting his name on cutting, whether it be unemployment benefits, cutting the salary thresholds for the stimulus, saying, hold on, we don't want to raise taxes on corporations. He has no shame in putting his name on this stuff publicly with no consequences. It speaks to, the sort of messed up nature of our current politics, man.
No, that's the most important point. Because whether you're talking about Senator Manchin or Senator Sinema, they proudly vote against the best interests of the American people. But more importantly, they do so knowing that the very proposals that they're voting against are incredibly popular. So for instance, recent polling shows that more than 2 in 3, this includes people of all political ideologies, more than 2 in 3 support Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan. Let's give you some details from that poll. 68% of US adults supported the president's infrastructure package dealing with physical needs, including road, bridge, and tunnel upkeep, as well as broadband internet expansion and electric vehicle investments. And this is according to a Monmouth University poll. Now, what happens once you start talking about the robust nature of Biden's proposal as it stands today, right? The elder care component, the child care component, do the majority of Americans still support it? Wow, this is shocking. It turns out that Americans actually aren't stupid, as Manchin suggested, and do find this incredibly popular. A similar majority, 64%, supports what the poll describes as, quote, a large spending plan to expand access to healthcare and childcare and provide paid leave and college tuition support. It took a lot for conservatives in this country to beat back the popularity of the Democratic Party under the New Deal. because it was so it provided so much financial relief and it made structural changes to our economy. It was incredibly difficult for Republicans to chip away at that. It took decades. And it was because the American people found those policies incredibly popular. And so when you read statements like this from the Hill, Democrats are nervous about Manchin's opposition to Biden's proposal. Why? Why are they nervous? There's nothing to be nervous about. Are they nervous about fighting back against one of their own to ensure that they actually do right by their constituents? Yeah, they're probably nervous about that. And look, at the end of the day, what really stands out to me is the reason why Manchin and Sinema are totally fine putting their names on awful votes is because we have no power, right? Cenk gets mad at me when I talk about this, I feel like. Others get mad because they think everything is about electoral politics. Oh, there's the fraud squad, there's this, we just need to elect one more progressive. No, none of that is going to be the end all be all. Because what you need is a well-organized electorate, well-organized workers to apply pressure persistently and effectively. Otherwise, there's no competition. There's no competition. We're fighting against corporate interests here. And if you do not have an organized electorate that's able to compete for the votes of these lawmakers, and we're competing against corporate interests, then we're done. We're done. If we don't have that power, we're not gonna win. So is it important to focus on electoral politics and ensure that you have progressives elected into Congress? Yes, that makes the process a little bit easier. But yeah, there are all sorts of corrupting factors in Congress. And when push comes to shove, if they need to figure out what they're gonna choose, it's easier to go through this path of least resistance if you have the corporate interests and the party establishment on one side, the side that obviously we disagree with, and then you have like a disorganized group of people who are just shouting at each other on Twitter. That's the state of politics right now. We need to be real about it.
Yeah, and I think there's absolutely something to what you're saying right now, Anna. Because honestly, when I say dog and pony show, I do think it kind of is a dog and pony show from Manchin, because part of his shtick is that he has to go home to West Virginia and let the people know that he's not one of the libtards and that he's a hardcore, he's pretty conservative, even though he has a D in front of his name. So a lot of this is brand protection, right? It's Manchin going out and saying, I'm not one of these Dems, I always push against them, blah, blah, blah. And then ultimately, voting for coronavirus stimulus when push came to shove, even though he did claw back some protections for the citizens. And ultimately, Anna, I side with you, because the funny thing about Manchin fighting tooth and nail to sort of scale back the robust nature of this infrastructure bill is that in West Virginia, his constituents will be disproportionately affected by this in a positive way. That's the craziest thing about it. So if there were sort of an organized left or an organized labor down there on the ground that could actually apply pressure to Joe at home, I think he'd absolutely be singing a different tune. But at home, it's obvious that his rep is just this brand thing where he's a different kind of Dem. And that's all he ever tries to protect in public is his sort of reputation as not being, just any old idiot liberal Democrat, which is just so backwards and stupid. Joe, you should be going out and taking care of the people who put you in power and who put you in office. And believe me, Joe, once you retire, you and your family will somehow miraculously become extremely rich, because that's just how this game goes.
That is how this game goes, absolutely. And when you talk to the people of West Virginia, I mean, remember when Democrats were caving to the GOP and corporate interests when it came to the $15 an hour minimum wage hike, there were people in Joe Manchin's state protesting pretty aggressively against it, against gutting the relief bill of having a $15 an hour minimum wage hike. So obviously constituents want the very policies that he's fighting against. The question is, do the Democrats who claim they support the infrastructure bill as it stands today really support it enough to campaign against one of their own? and really push him to do the right thing? That's the question. So when you read about how Democrats are nervous about Manchin, in reality, Manchin should be nervous about the Democrats. But unfortunately, it's not playing out that way.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.